Hello, it's Dryden, and I'm back for another packed week of development on Disinherited. There was quite the variety of progress this week, from new art, to bug fixes, to traps, and a new look for a familiar boss. So let's get into it. I'm Dryden Thomas, and this is week 7 of my 100-day quest to finish Disinherited. It's a side-scrolling roguelike game where you catch, throw, and parry your way through Death's domain to kill the Grim Reaper and claim eternal life, all despite your father who cut you out of his will. And if you like roguelikes, don't forget to roguelike this video. Let's start with the goal of this week, which was cleanup. As the Infinite Machine area comes together, I now have a decent chunk of the game approaching completion. But there have been some issues too. Sometimes the stuff that I make for these videos isn't quite perfect on the first try. Please try to contain your shock. Sometimes it's incomplete or doesn't feel how I want or actively breaks other things. That's especially true when it interacts with some of the legacy code that I stitched together while in the competition phase. One project I've been meaning to tackle is projectile pooling. If you don't know, pooling is a tactic that game devs use all the time to increase performance on their games. Here's how it works, using our favorite prop, the bone, as an example. The method I've been using to spawn them in so far is straight to the point. I have a prefab, and the launcher clones it, creating a bone. Then the bone is given a velocity, and it flies through the air. If it hits something or takes enough durability damage, it is deleted. Now that's a fine approach, it works. But there's a cost to how simple that is. Every new object that gets created has to be stored somewhere in the computer's memory in a block. And then, when it's destroyed, that block can be used again. There's this thing called a garbage collector that does that work of telling the computer, hey, you can use this again. However, that process is a little bit expensive, and you never know when it's going to happen, so if it happens at an unlucky time, you could cause a lag spike. So here's how the pooling strategy gets around this. The first bone that's thrown will get created just like last time. But when it breaks, instead of being destroyed, we're just gonna deactivate it. The projectile manager can then hold on to that bone. The next time a bone gets thrown, the projectile manager is gonna be asked if there's an inactive bone that can be used instead of creating a new one. If there are, it's gonna reactivate that one and use it instead. And if there's not, we can create another new one and have it in the pool. When you leave the area, the projectile manager knows about all the projectiles, so it can clean them up and delete them when it's not gonna matter if there's a lag spike during a scene transition. Rewriting all that code and resetting up every single projectile took a bunch of time, but I wasn't done yet. All kinds of new and exciting bugs sprung out of this process. Here's my favorite example. If an enemy threw a projectile and I parried it and then it destroyed that enemy, the next enemy that would use that kind of projectile would pull out a player-coded projectile, so it would automatically hit them and destroy them. Kinda funny, but absolutely broken. I just needed to create a new function that could reinitialize the projectiles after they get pulled out of the pool. I also got around to implementing some of the features that were only partially integrated, like Arachne's Hamadion, which catches projectiles when you roll through it. And actually, I did that live on stream in my first ever game dev stream. It was basically just a test, and I didn't announce it anywhere or expect anybody to show up. I thought maybe a couple people would come by and say hey, but instead there were an average of 100 people there. And chat was wild. Ollie of Mashup Games made a donation with the express purpose of funding more bones in Disinherited. And while I think I need a more coherent framework for acknowledging and thanking this kind of support, I couldn't resist. So there are now 2 more bones in Disinherited, the Radius and Ulna, and those can spawn in randomly anytime that a standard bone projectile would be thrown. Also during the stream, I showed off the colored and drawn version of the cat from last week. Here it is in all its glory. I asked chat what the color of the eyes and fur should be, and frankly, I've never seen a group of people more divided over anything. So what we decided was that it should be customizable in-game. I don't think that's going to be terribly hard for me to implement. However, we still do need to decide what the default cat looks like. So I'll be putting out probably a series of polls to narrow it down to a winner. Okay, now for the main event. Augusta's new look. If you're new here, Augusta is the first boss I added to the game that wasn't the Grim Reaper. I love her as a character. Her tragic backstory as a genius scientist whose contributions were not only stolen but buried, which started her quest to become immortal and build the Infinite Machine. I was also really attached to her visual design. However, after designing Samuel's father a couple weeks ago, and I think his design is exactly what it needs to be, some folks pointed out that the silhouettes are pretty similar. Another issue is that when I drew Augusta's model, she was like the third character I animated with 2D rigging, so there are some pieces of it that were a little unpolished if you look close. And last, after developing the visual design of her area more, I wanted to bring in some new motifs and recharacterize her a little bit. So I went back to the source. Ada Lovelace, the original mathematician who inspired the character. She looks so weathered and grim in these old photos that I assumed she was older, but it turns out she only lived to be 36. I decided to age her down from the old design. I could have kept her the same age, but I do have another boss character in the works that's an older woman, so this would keep those two distinct as well. Someone in the last video mentioned that the theme of lightning bugs and toads evoked a mechanical bog, and that really resonated with me. The outfit now takes inspiration from a lily pad, and the color scheme that I've already established of purple, yellow, green, and copper neatly aligns with the heather, peat moss, and soil of a bog. I love it when things work out like that. Her outfit reflects her noble status, but it's a bit damaged and dirty from time spent in Death's domain. The bottom of the skirt is torn, I imagine from getting caught in gears over years of work, and she wears a visor to work on finely detailed machinery, but it makes her a bit more intimidating as a foe, too. And her animation rig has leveled up. So many more bones now. Because I'm finally really understanding how these sprite skin meshes work, I could take her hands and draw them separately, giving several different pose options for a lot more expressiveness. Now, rather than shooting a drone from her hand, which was a bit of a stretch in terms of making sense, the drones come from cannons on the walls, and she gestures to make them fire. When she drops below half health, the cannons both fire at once, and the lightning blast now has its own special animation. She's not quite done yet though. She still needs some kind of melee attack so that stun-based builds have more to work with, and there's no proper phase transition or death yet. But we're getting there. Some more effort went into uniquifying the infinite machine area as well. Several people suggested moving platforms, and while I drew those last week, I didn't get them implemented yet. Moving platforms are one of those things in games that seem like such a given, but they're actually quite tricky to get right. Making a passenger move on platforms can result in some funky physics, but the best way I've found so far is to just make the passenger a child of the platform when they touch it, and then undo that when they stop touching it. There's also kind of a subtler problem. When you leave the platform, you should retain the momentum of the platform. You wouldn't think that this would make that much of a difference, but it's so ingrained in us that this is how the world works that it feels really jarring when it doesn't happen. So I had to get that incorporated into my player script. Also, the way I've done moving platforms in the past for Lighthoof, they've always traveled along a certain path. But in a randomly generated world, they probably have to be able to adapt. And what's more, I don't want them to be able to crush stuff between walls because I don't really have a good solution for that, at least not yet. So here's what I did. I made it so that they'll move in their starting direction until they sense some ground about 1 unit in front of them. Then they'll pause and go the opposite direction and start looking for some ground that way. It was a little bit of a fun challenge to make this work using as little data and logic as possible, but I think my solution's pretty neat. For a little added life, I put some gears under here and made them rotate at different speeds. And as one more last minute thing, I snuck in another style of trap. These steam pipes. These test your timing ability to jump through, and there are a couple of different styles. This front-facing one can spawn in as a background decoration, so you can walk through it. But the other ones are platforms, and I plan to have them replace tiles. I have some ideas as to how I could do this in the procedural generator, so subscribe if you want to see if I succeed. Alright, that's all for this week. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.